Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Bouvines fought on July the 27th, 1214, one of the single most important battles in the Middle Ages, if anything, for the sort of billiard balls effect that the outcome of the same clash would have for the various countries involved, the rulers struggling for the control of the major European thrones and beyond. I've already made a video about the Battle of Bouvines. It was one, I can say, some of the very first. I think I made it in 2020. There is this handful of very important medieval battles that I covered back in the day, and like Hattin, Courtrai, in the Battle of Stirling Bridge. There are others as well, that including Manzikert, that one of the few ones that I lost and I will have to remake. And I'm actually wondering, considering the difference in style and content that exists at this point from those days on Schwerpunkt, whether I should remake certain videos on that. But also of the philosophy that if those came first, let's say, we have to give a chance to what came later, and if anything along the way, we can always make a special or some sort of other in-depth analysis. And today's video is the first of its kind in this sense, because it really goes in that deepening direction, so to say, because it's basically an analysis of a part of a battle, certain aspect of the battle, such as the arrangement of the armies, the battle deployment, and anything that can't be squeezed out of that, or at least some important aspects that we can deal with. For example, in the video with more time, in the video about the Battle of Bouvines, that as you know, when I make battle videos, they're normally tactical analysis, right? Pure and crude, which I think are the best of my videos, not just because I specifically specialize in tactical reconstruction in my job, and for the same era, by the way, even within the Middle Ages, I am between sort of mostly the late 13th, this is not the case, but still 13th, early 14th century. But because from the tactical analysis, the method employed, the reading of the sources, you can get a much better grasp of not just the battle in itself, which I think is very important, because I really want to know how things happen. This is my broader motivation in the historical, in a strictly historical sense. And of course, I may have other motivations at the root of it all that transcend those. But when I'm in front of a historical puzzle, I really want to have the whole picture well neatly outlined. And this is really the only way to do that. I know that it's more engaging to have sort of simpler videos that really show you with, with some graphics, in a few sentences, what sort of happened. I really don't understand what's the appeal. I know that, of course, many people don't have or buy books in general, but so to read, for example. I know that this year, for example, the Osprey House that has had its own financial issues in the past years has made a booklet, one of their volumes, about the Battle of Bouvines itself, right? And I'm actually not thrilled by that, because I actually just published this year an article that actually heavily criticizes one of the, I'm not saying which battle this is, but heavily criticizes what Osprey has done. That's for that battle specifically, so I'm not telling you to simply buy Osprey. Most people do it for the pictures, let's be honest. I must say, of course, over the years they improved, but when it gets also to tactical reconstruction, to some sort of broader finesse, and especially sort of critical insight, sometimes these authors fall short. I don't know specifically about the author of this 2025 volume, but let's say there are great classics in historiography recounting the Sunday of Bouvines. I don't even have to, in fact, literally repeat the title of some of these works. I would say and they are all sort of public by this point. You at least the historical one, the most important, and really, it's not like our understanding about these battles in a strictly fundamental way has changed, right? There are some battles, actually the same one I published this year, that is a bit of an exception, was gotten completely wrong. At some point, I think I will talk openly. I will sort of simply read from my own article. I will make maybe a series, mini-series dedicated to that, showing you also the mistakes that other scholars make in these reconstructions. In fact, even as an expert in these topics, first of all, you can't be an expert in all battles, because it takes, especially for 13th century battles, 14th century, etc., like really a lot of work. It takes forever. I always say that in my, let's leave aside my thesis that dealt with multiple battles, but at least only a few were really big. And my master thesis that I wrote like over the span of 1 year, even though I had still last exams in between, really required that enormous effort, because you have to translate. I was the first person, for example, to translate, at least in my own language, a certain vernacular of the same battle, and so there are so many different elements that you have to take in consideration when you study a battle that are not that easy, right? First of all, there is a strategic context, campaign background that is very important to analyze politically, strategically, etc. And there can be some cursory knowledge of how a battle actually goes. But, for example, the video that I made myself about the Battle of Bouvines was following like what again, in this case, we don't even have too many sources explaining us how the battle actually went. Because it wasn't even notoriously a huge battle. It was very important from a political point of view, to say the least. It's one of the most important battles in the history of mankind, actually, for reasons that I also described in other videos dedicated, as I often do, beyond sort of the tactical dimension to the life and times of this battle, or why this battle is important. And Bouvines is one that definitely will have to repeatedly come back on, because it's such an evergreen. Every single aspect, political, strategical, tactical, and cultural, as a matter of fact. It's really the peak of medieval feudalism, chivalry. You can argue that, eventually this boomed further thanks to Bouvines during the 13th century, but this is exactly the point. This is like a spring moment, and again, not a huge battle at all, even compared to the ones that were actually fought in the era. In fact, I will not make any names, but some of the bigger channels always say, oh, look, even the Battle of Bouvines was actually small, so you have to consider that all battles, more or less, at the time were small. No, they weren't small at all, right? And there is some perspective one must get about this picture. Not just, for example, the Battle of Bouvines was part of a multi-theater campaign in general. And in fact, that's also one of the other reasons why we should study this also from a strategical background. But it doesn't necessarily, I mean, France and England are not necessarily outer, and Germany are not necessarily outer countries at this point. In general, you have to realize how that context could be so seminal for the spread of a civilization, nevertheless, from the same system that was yet to, in fact, fully take off at this point. The point I was making before, though, is that even when you make such sort of tactical analysis, for example, in the way I've done for YouTube, I've never really published like an academic reconstruction about the Battle of Bouvines myself, right? First of all, because there is such an enormous bibliography about it, which is mostly scholarship talking about the battle, but you should at least read that all before like even starting to think about how to reconstruct this, and even saying, can I legitimately add something new to this? But it is also true that until you do that, you can't fully know whether other scholars are okay with that. For example, I have enormous reservations on some recent titles that have come out of about certain battles. For example, the Battle of Courtrai. There are great names, famous at least in medievalistics in these years, also about military history, but that I often say do not actually tackle the art of war per se. So you can have a beautiful book about this battle, but paradoxically, when the actual battle is explained. Like, the author does not even make a comparative analysis of the sources to try to reconstruct what actually happened on the battlefield, and it's more like a flashy series of images to tell you, oh, look at what more or less happened here. So it turns out these works can be quite sloppy at a time, and if you really have a lot of time, a lot of motivation, and you just happen to make this work and to research in these fields, you can actually go step by step, battle by battle, and realizing that most of, at least the approximation we've made about the medieval art of war is, depending on which parameter, fundamentally rigged, and or at least it could be profitably rewritten in a sort of, I would say, dignified way for the third millennium. And I think, at least in my own field, I'm going toward that direction and publishing a lot about big battles that have never been covered, and I'm putting lots of things in perspective in terms of medieval European warfare. In any case, today's video of mine is just, again, the simple reflection on the broader arrangement of the armies at the Battle of Bouvines, and some of the material I'm using here is for the sketch and whatever I used also for the video about the battle. So you can find some same information, except here we're going to reflect on different aspects of the same. So we're not even taking the battle in consideration. Of course, it is in the background of this all. You know also how the battle went. Hopefully because you have watched my video, but even more hopefully because you know this battle. And for reasons that, in fact, are not strictly tactical or technical, even about the deployment of the various armies. In any case, you know that the clash at Bouvines unfolded as a pivotal clash that reshaped medieval European politics, to say the least, pitting the French forces under King Philip II Augustus against a coalition led by Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, Count Ferdinand Ferrand of Flanders, who was from the House of Portugal, and Renaud de Damerton, the Count of Boulogne. I made different videos about medieval France, the county of Artois, about the county of Flanders, of course. We also talk about Otto IV, and we haven't, if anything, made too much about Philip II. We talked a lot about sort of medieval France institutionally speaking, governmentally speaking, mostly going by phases. We lack some sort of more strictly biographical, sort of like king by king kind of policy explanation, especially for the Kingdom of France, that had tendentially, especially from this time, this moment onward, probably from this battle, such a unitary tendency, at least, really important to understand. But we're getting there as well. Again, this is always the case with Schwerpunkt. What you don't see yet having been covered, even after years, is going to come sometime, because my purpose is broader complexion of the picture. There are so many aspects naturally connected with the clash. Also, as far as England is concerned, King John at this point was truly threatening to destroy the Capetian dynasty and basically turning northern France into sort of a pulverized political landscape with an hegemonic England lording over that. John was actually a great king, and people just judge him because he kind of lost, even though, yeah, he lost badly. There is no doubt about this, but let's say also managed to recover in a clamorous way in England, maintaining the same crown and managing to internationally bond with powers that managed to prop his rule. And again, the same campaigns of in northern France, there had been a first failure that had brought to the loss of Normandy already, but then he came back in force. And in this pincer movement to France, which what would be the Anglo-German advance at Bouvines was just one of the prongs, really threatened to wipe out the Capetian monarchy as we know it, right? And with potentially enormous consequences that weren't even just about, in fact, like France, but obviously with the Holy Roman Empire at this point, there is the young Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, was yet to become, in fact, a full ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and had been battling against Otto IV in Sicily. The political background I gave you in that video about the meaning of the Sunday of Bouvines, which we analyze exactly these aspects. So definitely today's video is not about that in general, but you know how big the picture actually was. There are some interesting aspects about the movement of the armies in the campaign up to Bouvines that are strictly part of the way eventually armies would deploy, but it's sort of like the before. Basically, the French were being chased by the Anglo-German forces that regardless of the fact that were just basically mercenaries paid by the English and a few vassals, like just the ones basically of the Northwest. Otto was not very popular in Germany, but these ones closer to France, of course, backed him because he, by defeating, let's say, and so you have actually the Holy Roman Emperor in charge, because of course John of England is away, and he is the main part. There are very interesting Anglo-German relations, as you know, especially during the 12th or 13th century involved. But let's say, had the Capetians been destroyed, much of the northwestern German vassals that were already habituated to be substantially autonomous would have enjoyed even a greater room of maneuver. Like most of the political game in Germany was not there, so the same emperor would have... it's difficult to say, because, of course, even a victory at Bouvines would have really strengthened Otto. We, again, also made a video about him, and especially Philip of Swabia, so how Otto had come to power. Then there's all the issue with the papacy that, as you know, first backed him as Holy Roman Emperor in exchange for at least the promise of not reuniting Germany, Italy, and Sicily. Instead, the first thing the guy does when he comes to Rome was trying to unite, especially Sicilian crown to the rest, and that's where, in fact, the young Frederick had actually the massive attributes to stand against him, and with very few forces. But it's around, in fact, the northern French theater that the matter would be settled by this encounter. So basically, the French themselves, again, were not, they were really facing from their side a formidable Anglo-German force, not an overwhelming one as it could have been in different circumstances. And by arriving at Bouvines and crossing the river Mark, that you can see also in the maps that I uploaded, they got news. Basically, the Anglo-Germans were near, that there would have not been time essentially to make the army pass through the bridge, which was notoriously also one of the sort of slowest and most delicate operations, especially with an enemy nearby in medieval warfare. So Philip II Augustus, that is, by the way, the guy who gives the name of to France as properly Royaume de France, as opposed to Regnum Francorum Occidentalium. So giving properly this fully national monarchic character to the French, with their language, with their stand as what will become, in fact, a tendentially imperial power, especially considering also we can consider Bouvines having crushed the same Holy Roman Empire, was not really in good shape already. And he decides to abort the crossing and to stand his ground at Bouvines, essentially in the plains just northeast of Bouvines and the Abbey of Cizouan. There is as we'll see now, specific terrain that I highlighted. You can see in any map, and that's formed a fairly coherent battleground. Not a perfect one, but one, in fact, that actually allowed for important room for, but not much maneuver per se. There would be flank attacks and different sort of episodes along the line, this is a moment in the art of war where armies were still relatively linearly deployed, and meaning that essentially the punching power of cavalry had not yet reached its peak, so the divisions were not much deployed in depth, as they would start being from a few decades, really, and from especially France, and not only, but at the full development of feudal warfare, and so this incredibly punching force of cavalry in depth, right, so to channel this boom, 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 like, gradual reserve, unleashing with some degree of safety as well, but still divisionally, like in one on the side of the other, right? So that basically we can follow the battle also in these normal three sectors, three divisions, because normally also the depth of formations would still be three divisions when the thing became along the other model. Eventually, you know how the battle unfolds, right? On the right, the French managed to attack the Flemish from the side with sophisticated cavalry tactics that were being fully developed. Let's say that the notion that the flank attack was derived from Crusade experience, etc., is BS. Basically, they had always had it. As a matter of fact, now it just was being more documented. In the center, there's a furious contest between the not just the cavalries of Philip Augustus, but also Otto IV, and their infantries, which is also telling about the fact that in this heavily feudal context, you have pretty stout infantries, which is they almost kill Philip, by the way. But basically, this combination cavalry infantry has the better hand, like it for in the case of effective. Of the French that are also of the French center, they're supported also by some detachments that were victorious on the left. However, there is an interesting stand of the Brabançon infantrymen dying to the last, also taking down lots of French with them at the end of the battle. But when basically all the other divisions of the Allies had collapsed, and these guys were eventually just surrounded by the overwhelming French forces and cut to pieces, but showing what kind of capacities they had, also because they were just too worthless as infantrymen to be ransomed, and they were considered as traitors anyway. And I made a video about Brabançons back in the day. I have another one incoming if the computer that I brought to repair will be handed to me in time, but we will cover it anyway at some point. And so you understand the brutality of this war. This Bouvines is incredibly raw in many ways, even at some battles that are also relatively contained in size, in absolute size, it turned out to be incredibly brutal, or even more brutal sometimes than greater engagements. And you have a bit like the best of this picture. In fact, I could go as far as saying that from a couple of, ever since we stopped the series about the history of law, I talked more about and introduced a new one that talks way more about a corner that we can say we skipped or didn't address, but that we haven't really talked about in depth and in width, especially. That is exactly this one, right between northern France, Flanders, certain parts of northwestern Germany, England. That is basically decry what we conventionally call, in fact, feudalism, chivalry, at least in its sort of properly elitary development, and making enough videos that hopefully will bring also the whole Europe together through this corner, right? It wasn't the only sort of powerfully active one, but it was, aside from the Mediterranean dimension, especially one of the Italian communities, the most advanced part of medieval Europe, and it had enormous impacts, as we know, also at every political, military, and social level on the neighboring Spain, Germany, Italy, and so on, right? And especially northern France and England have a quasi-magical background. They are also different among each other. The same goes for Flanders, etc. So there is enough variety to really look around. There are the Bretons, there is also the Celtic French that, however, is a bit out of this game in a broader sense. And Bouvines is such a catalyst of much of what is going to happen in this country also afterwards. So just to add, because as you understand, a video like this is going to be not much about digressions, but about this bit of brainstorming as well, about the battle as well. Looking at the maps that I inserted here, but you know how the clash went. Like Count Ferdinand deployed his forces to confront the French rear guard, right? So basically, in the deployment, the French had again switched from column to battle formation, and since, as we've seen, they were occupied in the crossing of the River Mark, what would turn to be the French right, basically between the Abbey of Sizwang and the behind, like the forested hills in the southeast, was the rear guard of the formations. Is really typical in many ways, and we'll talk better about how certain armies deployed. What kind of order medieval hosts really had. Nothing really to envy to classical armies, as a matter of fact. I don't understand how people are still so incredibly, say, clueless about how advanced the medieval art of war really was. So you have Ferdinand deployed there, and the French rearguard forming in front of him, the right flank of the royal army, positioned in the southern sector of the battlefield. The engagement occurred across, therefore, this broad, unobstructed plain stretching from Sizwang in the south to Gruzon in the north. Gruzon is just like a smaller settlement, it's even smaller than Bouvines, in the northwest, right? This is essentially behind the Anglo-German right. And this landscape is, especially for this sort of longitudinal development, really ideal for cavalry maneuvers, right? Yet still constrained by natural features, because again, in the west you have the Mark with heavily marshy terrain. By the way, between Gruzon and Bouvines. Bouvines is on the marsh again. That's the bridge that the French were crossing. In the south, again, there are streams. There's forested terrain. The Anglo-Germans have these hills, this higher, this elevations that they used to sort of to deploy on, as we'll see now. And so everything unfolded fairly. You can argue by the laws of chivalry, even though this is a bit of a myth, the fact that chivalry was fully intended in a purely, say in a conventional way, that armies would simply uniform to. This is definitely not much the case. Also considering what kind of tactics, to an extent, everybody involved used. Right. We will digress at some other point on how, again, the ideal different from reality, and you don't have to think that it was a positive, right? Because most people think that the ideal differed from reality in some sort of hypocritical difference between the two. It's actually not the same. It's mostly how we as moderns interpreted certain sources and pretending them to just mirror what was happening on the battlefield, and exchanging, for example, certain clerical mentality, especially in northwestern Europe, that, as you know, didn't have much communal writing. They had mostly courtly writing, and mostly the clergy was involved in this, would simply recount the battle in a way. It was not even necessarily more or less edifying sometimes, but that would have really been fought normally by other peoples here. Like, for example, the flank attacks used by the French on the right. How loyal would they really considered? It's not like even that they wouldn't be considered actually unchivalrous. In fact, there were lots of issues regarding this kind of tactics. That is to say, a true man fights just like with attacking the enemy, meeting him face to face in open field. These flank attacks sometimes were a matter of sort of a dark matter, morally wise, but they were also importantly tactically experimented to actually gain a victory. It depends. It's very interesting to see even who were the men who actually performed them and why, under which orders, and who had the idea of this, whatever. Equally, you see the Anglo-Germans using these rough, largely heretical Brabançon infantrymen that are actually also effective, together a bit, telling the truth, with the German and the French infantry in the center. They are, however, professionals, and they must be cut to pieces till the last man in the end, because they're really fighting themselves to kill, and especially at that point when they had been surrounded and they had nothing to lose but succumbing, however, to cavalry. This is very important because, as you know, in Flanders there had been, and there would keep being, some important attempts to sort of put into practice certain ideations of anti-feudal struggle at Similia, so against infantry, against cavalry, etc. But Bouvines also settles cavalry superiority in here. All right, this is already been happening from like a couple of generations fully, so that infantry for until basically the beginning of the 14th century will not win a battle on its own. But this doesn't mean either that infantry is suppressed in the process. I mean, it is suppressed in the battlefield, but it's still keeping to develop in parallel to feudal institutions that also, eventually also as the center of Bouvines shows, is cooperating, of course, with the very monarchs, right? And this shows you how, in fact, how important infantry was, even for the single most feudally elite nobiliar rulers of the era. This is yet again another very important notion, because very often in feudal historiography you do not find a great deal of reference about infantry, but it's also true that at this point even these regions had emerged from a background where infantry had not been really influent. We've seen it, especially in some Norman battles. We've seen it again in Flanders, and so even France and Germany, in different feudal eras, had important infantry to rely on, even in the most unsuspectable areas. Consider that this is not an overwhelmingly documented context either, so we can actually think that infantry was a real thing, and that simply nobody liked to chant that for some reason, but mostly, again, coming from a feudal elite, but they couldn't even hide the fact that they had been so important at Bouvines. The Mark River, we mentioned it before, with its notably swampy banks, flowed along the western edge of the plain, limiting tactical options for retreat or flanking maneuvers. This aspect is actually crucial because, like in many battles, this is like either you win or die, right? And this is true, paradoxically, for the French, right? The Anglo-Germans have at least these heights, then the ancient Roman road towards Tournai that they have come from, together with like the French as they were pursuing them. They can, and they will in part retreat. It's interesting to see, by the way, that the Brabançon infantry was on the right end of this, the most distant from the Roman road, and so actually they were deployed there probably also to make them stand their ground till kind of the end. They were also a bit encased between Gousson, the marked marches, the aforementioned heights. So that's a position that favorable to infantry, but also trapping them a little bit. But the real trapped here are the French, right? Philip Augustus, it's also incredibly, we will look at the previous side of the story in another video, but the decision to stop the crossing and saying, okay, but this you could save yourself, not really, because if the French army had been cut in two and the Anglo-Germans had taken out that half, like the Capetian monarchy would have died. So Philip II Augustus was a massive leader in many ways. He has this enormous moral force. He officiates the same Mass on Sunday. We talked a lot in our videos about history of religion, about the traditional role of the king as properly the ultimate clerical ideology. This is literally a Sebastocratic ideal that stemmed from antiquity, and that in this the Western Franks are still incredibly violently into since Clovis and again, don't even get me started on this topic because is of prepotent importance, especially when you look at the actual victory at Bouvines. So Philip has this, he's France incarnated in all its imperial might that it would especially achieve at this point. He is blessed by God. He really is the guy who officiates the sacred rites as the leader of the French, and in this sense as a Christian authority, really, himself. And so he decides to fight with his retreat lines cut. Yes, there is the bridge, but that's basically insufficient for an army like that to withdraw in case of rout. There is the marshes, the forest. If you are defeated, you're done. And so this is at times used also for boosting the morale of the army. Either you stand your ground or die. That can be actually an important motivation. And there are many commanders that actually choose this position, even after, say, crossing relatively small streams, because when you talk about retreat, some battle lines can do that intact. If there is this minimal, even geographical, orographic, hydrographic obstacle, they can break down it so that they're easier to cut down eventually in what is not going to be an orderly withdrawal. This is instead definitive. The mark is, it's not a huge water course, but it's enough to basically seal off the fate of the French in case of defeat. So this aspect is incredibly important. Now, as the Allied left wing, composed of approximately 600 Flemish and 500 Hainaut knights, extended their cavalry units northward, they intersected the Tournai-Bouvines road. This is the movement that compels Otto to abandon his westward advance, veering right toward the north. So basically, if you have a map there, the guy was going straight towards Bouvines. Instead, the battle took place in this sort of northwest to southeast axis. And so basically, from the ancient Roman road, the same Anglo-German column, Anglo-German, Flemish, whatever Allied column, begins to deploy on the right, heading essentially towards the mark, as we've seen, toward Gruzon in the north. And so, as we've seen, deploying division after division in that kind of order. So there is a methodical organization of the Holy Roman Emperor's troops on this rise of ground, leveraging the elevation for defensive advantage. The battle is going to be pretty straightforwardly open, but there is going to be a lot of back and forth. Basically the various divisions, the battle lines are really going to attack, withdraw to the previous position, and so falling back at the bases of those hills is also allowing for some reserves to back you, because as we'll see now, this is not a single line, right? There are sort of more in depth, especially in the center with the infantry, that there is some kind of more combined arm tactics there with greater depth of the formation constituted by different arms, in fact. And so, again, the Allies here have an important also advantage in terrain. They orderly deploy with the martial competence that armies of this kind would have at the time in the bloom of the feudal era, and they pose at some point to consolidate their forces, because again, you've just passed from column to line formation. You have to assess the situation. You're seeing basically that the French are going to give battle. You can't really see your enemy across this distance. That is not enormous, right? We'll see now that basically the width of the battlefield is 2 kilometers, which is a lot, actually. But the distance, of course, between the battle lines is pretty narrow, and of course also because at some point it will face with one another. But the distance between those heights and Bouvines is merely like a couple of kilometers themselves, and the French themselves will essentially advance and deploy along the line. This is very interesting, because there's a part of in this kind of warfare. There's not much just driven by feudal ethos. That, however, wants the foes to truly confront one another on equal footing. Like, especially when you look at these feudal armies with so much heavy cavalry, you realize that in order to put everything in place in terms of aligning the troops, like coordinating, giving orders, you gave your enemy, and the enemy gave you enough time to set everything up. You wanted really to get it over with this main engagement, so it had to be done the fair way. And so there isn't much of sneaky maneuver. Of course, it sometimes there were chances of this kind, people trying to cross, a river, storming the enemy army during negotiations, etc. This is different. Here, basically, everything is in theory. There is a general level of disorder that you have to compact in the moment in which you deploy. This is enough also for the enemy to do so. So everything becomes complementary at that point. In fact, as the Allies arranged their units, Philip Augustus, aware of the coalition's numerical slight advantage, estimated at 1,300 to 1,500 knights and 7,500 infantry, compared to the French 1,300 knights and 6,000 infantry, widened the front line of his knights' formations to counter the threat. This also would be normal, as we've seen. Here, I will not descend also in the depths that are not described by the sources themselves. But of course, there was a general flexibility in the army organizations, the various subunits, the sort of divisions, squads, colonel, etc. That would sort of line up troops one next to one another, a bit ad hoc to counter also, in fact, the enemy line equally, in a way that basically the enemy wouldn't try some sort of sneaky flank attacks. Paradoxically, it's the French that will succeed to pull that off on the right. And my experience, I almost published an article about this topic of flank attacks, like surprise attacks by concealed reserves on the flank. Here, we don't even understand whether they had been concealed or not. It was simple sort of, outmaneuvering during the battle, which could really happen. We rolled that back and forth. But whenever you hear of some successful outflanking maneuver, it turns out that basically it's the only instance. I mean, there is no instance of like a failed flank attack reported by the sources. Why? Because it turns out that likely everybody was planning one, but only the side that succeeded in enacting it had that edge. It's not like the others didn't think of that, but they maybe hadn't found the right occasion, but they had surely planned that, and they knew already at this point where these flank attacks were actually relatively, let's say, not new, but again, they were developing on a larger scale, and so they required more skill, more leadership, more organization. Only the better would succeed, and so that the sources tell us about that, but they don't tell us about those who sort of maybe tried but failed to some extent. Besides, there is a lot going on in the first rank, especially in the parts of the line where the cavalry is in the first, in the forward position, compared to infantry that, as we'll see, also would be actually in front of the cavalry in the center, where the two sovereigns were facing one another. But again, there is a level of symmetry that is also, as we were recounting before, shared in need and necessity by the various contendants, because that's how you mostly fight. That's how mostly, again, by scale, these armies really were themselves, regardless of the absolute divide is not enormous. Now, with the arrival of Renaud de Damerton and his reinforcements to the Anglo-German right, and this guy was essentially a rebel. He was the Count of Damerton, Mortain, but especially of Boulogne, connected with the houses of Lorraine and Flanders. So these were essentially the rebellious vassals, right? He was a Frenchman, but again, Flanders was the majority of Flanders was a French vassal historically. There were also Frenchmen ruling there, or that were mixed with the Flemish as well. And so at that point, the Anglo-German right is stiffened by the troops of the Count of Boulogne, so that the French have to extend their front further to cover that their own left at that point. And it's been estimated, because we're actually told by William the Breton in his chronicle, also in the Philippus, there's evidence of this, that the width of the battle line was 2,000 paces, which is something like almost 2,400 meters in length. It may seem amazing, but when we actually make the maths of simply the formations involved by numbers and space occupied, we realize that, of course, you needed for these tens of thousands of men to really wide formations, especially in this case where there wasn't much in depth going on. And so the width of the formation was sort of the most important side of the story. At some point, we can also read the sources of the battle because that's interesting. But here we're making a specifically different thing. Now, the Allies faced southwestward, basically, directly into the blinding sunlight, which was at that point because the sun had already been going. All the maneuvers during the day, which were after midday, had brought the sun on the other side. And the French, instead oriented northeastward, benefited from the sun warming their backs, so to say, a tactical advantage on this oppressively warm day. By the way, in July, it's past midday. Imagine that. I mean, even if it is this is technically not Northern Europe, but let's say it's not going to be that fresh, especially if you're into a metal armor, armed from head to toe, and having to sustain all the burden of all that, and just think about the tension, the adrenaline, and how you may be feeling, especially in combat. There were people who simply died out of syncopes, right, of exhaustion, literally dying on the spot without having been hit by anything, but simply exhausting themselves in the moment. This can happen even in Northern Europe, for that matter. We have instances of people stripping themselves of their armor because it was too hot. So the front, as we've seen, spanned almost 2.5 kilometers, with the Allied left wing and French right each covering 1,240 meters, roughly, as detailed by, as we've seen, the contemporary chronicler William the Breton, who noted the French right wing extent in his Chronicon. And the entire front in his Philippus as well. We're fairly specific about the sizes. You can make the math of the units also in an interesting fashion, even though too much is unknown, as always, like with the numbers of medieval armies. But it's not even that prohibitive to more or less imagine what we're talking about here, regardless of who was actually like the effectively fighting force of all that number or not. Now, the Allied left wing under Ferdinand's command comprised mounted troops from Flanders and Hainaut, a formidable cavalry force led by Arnaud of Audenarde. Otto stationed himself at the center, surrounded by his knights and infantry. So remember, these rulers have always their bodyguard, but the infantrymen sort of follow. It's this hierarchical stratification of forces. Like if you're the Holy Roman Emperor, you have like the universe articulating itself downwards from your Holy Ghost. We know of Saxon pikemen, German heavy infantry, like with a resplendent wagon adorned with an imperial eagle over a dragon, serving as rallying point during the battle, symbolizing imperial authority. Now, there is much to say about the symbolism, because, of course, the imperial eagle is, of course, like the most straightforwardly Apollonian symbol, but this black dragon was described, especially in the French sources, as some sort of relic of paganism. In a more traditional sense, the fact that the eagle was over the dragon, of course, symbolizes the fact that the Holy Ghost has the capacity to transfigure, to tame the darker sides of the self, and so to fully achieve divine transfiguration in the struggle in holy combat. You can't win if you don't evoke these darkest forces. It's interesting that this wagon, this sort of carroccio, just for thinking about what, for example, the Lombard League had been feeling against the same Holy Roman Emperors recently, was, for example, used by the Germans here, that deploy also an interesting amount of infantry on their own. The Germans had, by this point, barely integrated a big deal what had become the gold standard civilization in the form of Western Frankish feudalism, mostly starting from Frederick Barbarossa, but I'd say their social certification at times was still, especially in northern Germany, where Otto ruled the most, relatively scarce, and therefore providing, in interest of proportion, with cavalry, more infantry to spend. Here, again, admittedly, there aren't so many German subjects fighting for Otto as he would have liked, but the fact that the infantry sided with him as well is interesting. If anything, it's like the vassals do not buy mostly his policy, and again, complicated background, but we will see this better in a sort of political video. Naturally, the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor would take the field against the King of France was huge, right? And this battle was a massive showdown of titans, so to say, for, again, a stake that was as high as it could get. The spirits were naturally galvanized from both sides, but you do see some different worlds facing, right? You have the English mercenaries, right, or English-paid mercenaries that are becoming a common practice in this. I also recently made a video about the so-called waning of feudalism, and that is used by that was used by both King John and the Saint Philip. Augustus, think about, it would mostly happen later during the Cathar, the Albigensian Crusade, right? Using more, say, reliable, monetarily dependent mercenaries, professionals, also non-noblemen, against the English in the north under monarchic guidance, and instead unleashing the more rebellious, rowdy barons of France after the Cathars in the south, simply cutting them to pieces and trying to carve like some kind of synchrony from that hell that Occitania was in terms of political fragmentation, in that sense, feudal intricacy. From the other, you have the Capetian market, and in fact is really providing itself with a more almost, again, imperial physiognomy, one that is very, as you've seen here, even with Philip II celebrating Mass himself, really taking on the banner of France at some the Oriflamme at levels that were so deeply archaic, but also redivive in this French national sense, historically speaking, to make a stand on the international scene that entailed not just the defeat of these rebellious vassals of the Angevins that had, of course, become kings of England historically, but in fact, sort of recovering control of on the rest of the entirety of the Kingdom of France that had, in fact, partly sided instead with these other elements. You also have the Flemish that tend to sort of autonomize themselves, of course, from a strong Capetian feudal force. They don't really want that much. Flanders is a feudal country still, but the towns have really increased very much their importance. They are, in this sense, a bit more anti-feudal in mentality, or at least they want their own specific constitutional autonomies. Then you have the Germans that are crude and brute that emerged, like actually from areas that had, as we were just explaining, just importantly feudalized and developed historically, but that were really another world, that are really not part of this Western English, Western European English and French mold. They really come from a relatively less advanced system that has been working sort of with different premises, with different mentality, more fragmented, elective monarchy. So again, well, what Central Europe really differs in this way. It doesn't matter how Otto and other rulers, especially trying to expand in the Rhineland, and that is, in fact, one of the most obviously westernized parts of Germany, Romanized, and so sharing that important level of civilizational development, mingled with also this higher international level. There is some important shortcoming of the German crown, and here Otto is paying for that, regardless of the ambitions that in fact were often projected by these German rulers on Italy, on Sicily, right? Because objectively, those were a much better place to rule from as a Holy Roman Empire than Germany. That in fact, like everybody was fighting against the Hohenstaufen from Germany, the rebellious princes, mostly the ones of Saxony that had lost the crown in that sense. In historical perspective, what do the Saxons do as soon as they get the Holy Roman Imperial crown? Go to the Mediterranean, doing the same identical thing that they had been opposing forever, just because it was their rivals who did that. Obviously, that was by far the single most convenient thing to do. And this counters a bit like the nationalistic 19th century idea that simply the Germans should have involved themselves with the Baltic, with sort of towards the Slavic East and so on, and Saxony would have been the greatest, like the most roughly in truly German land, because the Saxons did instead immediately what the Swabians, the apparently more again softened or at least sort of more westernized and Mediterranean attracted universal rulers done it. They follow exactly this on the same footsteps, and actually they do worse than them in performance. Now, accompanying Otto were only four, let's say, important German nobles: Bernhard von Horstmar, Otto von Tecklenburg, Konrad von Dortmund, and Gustav von Randerath. All right, so these are basically all mostly like representatives of the aforementioned background, supporting, like from mostly this northern perspective, a Saxon leader like Otto of Brunswick. And this, of course, like their presence underscored the coalition's reliance on some regional German support, but overall, this was in a German national sense fairly scarce. And again, most German princes had started really having enough of Otto himself. They were just like a bit attendistically waiting, in fact, for what the situations would unfold. Normally, German princes didn't want to serve. In fact, this elective monarchy that was thus less centrally powerful, and they were a bit allergic to serving abroad. Some would, especially the ministeriales that we have also a series dedicated to, that were in fact and unsurprisingly mostly loyal to the emperor and the bishops. This is interesting because if you look at the presence of German infantry, it's as if those were not really ministeriales that were mostly nice at this point, but it's as if that lower, sort of more bound social element was paradoxically more loyal than the feudal one to the institutions in Germany. The disposition of Otto's formation at Bouvines remains relatively debated among historians. Of course, there are some things we don't know. While it is logically that knights led the vanguard, as suggested by the tactical norms of the period, the sources do not explicitly contradict this, and Otto's limited cavalry, approximately 275-350 knights from the non-Flemish regions, necessitated infantry support, likely following closely in an assault. We will see this also better in different videos, and what was the actual interaction of cavalry and infantry. As you know, I don't have a specific playlist dedicated to this topic in particular, but we will surely maybe create one also to have it more readily available. The Allied right wing was commanded by Renaud de Damerton, as we've seen, but also William Longespay, Earl of Salisbury, one of the most sort of important knightly representatives, surely at Bouvines, also confirming like a specifically English presence in the clash. The name is says it all, right? William Longsword, and this, of course, in the time, this is probably a time of heavy chivalric culture. Right? We will stress this better also with our examples here and there, but let's talk about this because Renaud, for example, employed innovative tactics. The Brabançon infantry was his own. He had been arranging them, so as we've seen, these were roughly 400, 700 pikemen to properly designed to stop cavalry, pikemen. There wasn't actually much of a difference between what's a pike and what's a spear, for example. The pike is just a long spear, and of course pikes had always been the only actual weapon to stop a cavalry charge, other than basically another cavalry charge. Mostly this happened with combined armed tactics, preferably missile support. Here there are archers, crossbowmen from both sides. We don't much see them, however. But these guys were really tough, as we've seen. The Brabançon were basically these rogue mercenaries, again, loaded in anti-universal ideology. This is absolutely normal. It's just like saying, I don't know, how many Protestants existed in the Landsknechten of Charles V, the most Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. And here it's relatively the same. Naturally, that there's the black dragon, that the black snake that sort of, in a sense, provoke, again, the need of having this inferior element, right, of the footman having this hellish inferior mentality is actually what still a Holy Roman Emperor wants and needs to have in order to be militarily complete, right, in a truly Catholic universal sense. And we can imagine also from Otto of Brunswick's background what kind of ideas existed around, for example, the papacy, the unsettled business of the investitures, the feelings towards Frederick II that had been literally adopted by the Pope, as his mother, Constance d'Hauteville, had entrusted him to the Holy Father, which she was dying also after the precocious passing of her Hohenstaufen husband, Henry VI. So this is a brutal world. It's a heavy world. It's a rough one, right? And this Brabançon infantrymen have really seen it across the Western European battlefields. They have raped, they have massacred, they have stood their ground against cavalry, they have disemboweled, they have scorched. Really, they have seen it. And they formed, according to sources, into a circular or crown-shaped formation, 2 ranks deep, apparently. Again, we can't be fully sure. This is a defensive structure that some would know as skiltrum, even though the term that is, as you know, mostly associated to the Scottish heavy infantry did not really have a specific ring meaning. It was just like a sort of, as you understand from the etymology, shield wall, even though the shield, it was mostly like a graphic thing to say, because what really mattered were the spears in the end. Now, the crown for me, of course, these were absolutely. We tend to. Just made a video about the tactical autonomy of infantry at this time, and we tend to underestimate properly the tactical capacities of infantry at this point. If anything, these guys have already understood with all this cavalry around and their sort of fairly good defensive position, and the fact that they're going to be cut off from the biggest engagement at the beginning, and so that they will have at some point to stand their ground if they really have to fight. They deploy in a way that basically thins the line, but also prevents an attack from any side. And this is how they will actually stand. Make their last stand, being butchered to the ground till the last, and taking down lots of French knights as well. Also because they were literally surrounded at that point. So however the thing went down, we don't know. But they apparently deployed in this manner, anticipating a bit how things would have evolved. Now, in Renaud de Damertin, the Count of Boulogne, launched his cavalry attack, because he still commanded otherwise a separated contingent of cavalry, still supported by infantry, however, through a gap outside, in fact, of this this Brabançon formation. So there would be a lot to say regarding this tactical interaction between cavalry and infantry, as far as especially this notion that there were corridors that allowed cavalry to sort of come out and come in to be better protected between a charge and another. Telling the truth, this is less practical than it seems, right? When you are out there in open field and you're attacking whichever enemy, right? People think that this tactic, for example, was particularly used during the Crusades, but what we see mostly is just that during the marches under, for example, Turkic archery fire, since they were not to engage but keeping to march until they met with the bulk of the enemy forces, cavalry would be surrounded in the formation by infantry that would parry the horses with their shields, because the horses were normally unbarred or at least insufficiently protected, so that they wouldn't become an easy target. But it's not like they would actually fight like that. I mean, surely had they been attacked in the moment, they would have found out a way to also to open this formation to have the cavalry come out. But normally this was an emergential condition. So even during this battle, even though we have sources telling us about this, we can imagine that either the Count of Boulogne had just a small cavalry condition, in fact, in order to just pass through, as we've seen, even not so many infantrymen themselves, and or he came out of that at a point for some reason, evaluating the situation, but for cavalry at that point had to engage against other cavalry and sort of clashing in open field, charge, then disengaging, reforming, not behind the infantry, because they would have lost too much time. Or it's possible that this may have even happened, there is no doubt, but normally this would have also given some kind of time advantage to the same enemy cavalry that at that point would have, if anything, had also better time lined up to sort of fall on enemies that had to come out of an infantry formation, so it might have not been too perfectly performing that, so losing something in terms of cohesion, order, whatever. In any case, even though Renaud ended up captured during battle, it's possible that this sort of cavalry-infantry interaction under his command was quite sophisticated. It was surely not a matter of just him, but it's possible that as living basically this frontier area between France and the Romance and the Flemish land, he had taken a bit like that feudal culture of the French and mixed it a bit with this sort of local townsmen, infantrymen, and had grown somehow more accustomed to this finesse. Again, that's often how few we know about these tactics in depth, but we can understand why they happen. And again, it's not like Philip II would have not known how to operate in that way. But also because he had simply, more cavalry and, for example, more infantry to use in more conventional combined arms tactics, rather than this sort of mini tactical show-offs that may have, however, not, in fact, as you see how the same Damertin ended, not really functioned at the end of the day. But it's not like they were bad either. The French assigned a robust right wing, led by Bishop Guerin, a hospitalier knight and skilled strategist, comprising 150 lighter cavalry from the Abbey of Saint-Médard at Soissons. I made a video about Soissons if you go in the playlist about the European communes. You see there the relation with the King of France, and also how important the relation there with the third estators in the monarchy was. In this sense, the abbey would have provided this sort of more lightly equipped cavalry that, however, would be used in part to sacrifice themselves in the charge to soften up, in fact, the enemy. And then charging with other troops from the flank in what was one of the most masterful cavalry operations of the time, as a matter of fact, in part because they had to counter Ferrand of Flanders troops that were quite tough on their own. This may have been really a very interesting use, in fact, of reserves and flank attacks combined, right? And it tells you a lot about how advanced actually these troops really were, even under the command of. Here we have again an hospitalier knight with experience in the East as well, but even troops that were raised by abbeys, as we've seen often in other videos about monasticism. You wonder how important these were also for the military. Well, they absolutely had their own retinues, and they were just compelled to provide them for the king, which they in part did gladly for their own safeguard. On the French right, there was also a contingent from Champagne. I made a video about medieval Champagne for the regional historical series. This counted 180 knights under Pierre de Remy, Gaucher de Saint-Paul and his troops, plus Mathieu de Montmorency and his men, the Count Jean de Beaumont and his forces, Aude, Duke of Burgundy. Made a video about the Duchy of Burgundy and how important it was, especially at this time, actually backing the French crown, unlike a couple of centuries later. The Burgrave of Milan with his knights, Etienne de Sancerre and his men, Hugues de Melonnet, Hugues and Jean de Mareuil, Michel de Arnes, and Gilles d'Assy. Right, these are names you can find in William the Breton's work. This wing bolstered by Burgundian and Champenois heavy cavalry. So we're talking about some of the most traumatically elite cavalry in the entire Western Christendom, because again, Burgundy, Champagne was just like the Ile-de-France, some of the most straightforwardly feudal and updated military regions in Europe. So we're talking probably the flower French cavalry. And in fact, they would be the ones enacting that combined arms altogether with these forces on the right that we're describing. They would be critical to the French strategy in the Battle of Bouvines. And they would really do a lot, not just, by the way, in this very spectacular engagement with the Flemish knights opposite to them, but also later in as much as supporting the center of Philip Augustus against the same Otto IV. By the way, these guys were deployed basically just on, together with their enemies along the road, the ancient Roman road between Tournai and Bouvines. So technically, whoever won that, say, had the French, as it happened, won that, they would have cut off by essentially taking and surpassing that road a significant direction of escape and withdrawal and route for the Anglo-Germans. Philip Augustus positioned himself at the center. Right, this is important because regardless of the relative equation, considering the size of the various divisions on the battlefield, they were normally sort of similar in scale and size. Of course, there had to be some bulk of the formation, and normally, let's say, armies could be asymmetrical to an extent, but it was important to center them well in the center with some leader that could simply also connect, like the two flanks, the two wing divisions, and therefore holding the entire system. As we've seen, that's also how Otto had deployed. This was fairly conventional. Again, if you look at the previous centuries, there are sort of more fantasies, we could say, solutions. But in part it was because armies were relatively smaller, and smaller units tend to interact more adventurously when the size is smaller, right? For bigger engagement, gradually, as we've seen, these divisions would take on more like this tripartite function, either on the, say, side by side, or especially later during the century, in depth. Philip deployed with the royal fleur-de-lys banner borne by Gal de Montigny, symbolizing the Capetian legitimacy. Surrounding the king were elite knights, so his bodyguards, including Guillaume de Bar, Barthélemy de Roye, Gauthier de Nemours, Pierre Mauvesan, Gérard de la Truille, Étienne de Longchamp, Guillaume de Mortemer, Jean de Rouvray, Guillaume de Garland, the Count Henri of Bar, and Pierre Tristan, whose loyalty ensured the king's protection during the melee. These, again, were the champions of France. So again, these were people habituated normally in their lifetime to chop to pieces hundreds of people as a completely normal thing. They were really incredible anthropological specimens. You could have imagined all the scars, all like properly the build. You know that there was a very specific genetic selection in these human breeds at an elite nobiliar level, and these were some of the most traumatically brutal people in the world at the time, and really not people you wanted to come close to. And they were properly devoted. I mean, they were the ones who lived more infused by the traditional doctrine of struggle and victory and self-sacrifice in holy combat. There was nothing greater than showing the greatest feats of bravery in face of the greatest odds, the ones who were chasing properly that fury, like in the battlefield, to tame her and possess her, to elevate to the greatest heights of heaven. And the visions that occurred on the battlefield of Bouvines were surely of this dramatic extent. If you know, by the way, how close also to these men the threat arrived, given that the same king at some point was exposed and almost dragged from the German side to, in fact, the enemy lines in the melee. And there is the infantry that helps them. And the infantry is all galvanized by this. I mean, they're being watched by their kings, by the noblemen. They feel protected by them, but they also know they have to sacrifice themselves in the process. There is a beautiful social, cultural, traditional spirit at play here that would have been just a marvel to behold. The French left wing, as we've seen, facing the Damartin, the Count of Boulogne, was under Robert, Count of Dreux. It included his brother Philip, the Bishop of Beauvais, that was pretty warlike, that would actually smash with his mace the head of William Longsword, the Earl of Salisbury, in battle. I made a video about the German warrior bishop, so to say, of this period, exactly the 13th century, from some Alsace sources, also iconographically. It's relatively close to this war, but the French bishops were not that different. Actually, Western bishops in general were fairly militarized at this point, and here Philip of Beauvais is a bit the proof of this. By the way, if you look at places, Dreux, Beauvais, Laon, here there is, for example, the Bishop of Laon as well in the French right, Pierre de Courtenay, Count of Auxerre, Nevers and Nemours, Jean de Nesle, the Viscount of Bruges. So these are also, there's sort of Flemish civil war as well, because there are some loyalist Flemish feudal authorities that are largely also French, and they fight with their knights. There is Thomas de Saint-Valery, the Lord of Gamache, with knights and infantry, Guillaume, Count of Ponthieu, with forces from his county and Vimont. So we find it really a mix of troops, and we understand how they were all more or less homogeneous in terms of cavalry and infantry segmentation. and we'll see now partly also the word array, but we find a multitude. It is beautiful about this feudal warfare that there is a tendentially subtle compaction here, but still the nature of power, especially again in these countries where it was understood in very traditional metaphysical sense. There is even a Celtic flavor to the Anglo-Saxon component. There is, again, as we've seen, this more brutal Central European German sense that there's this French nobility, sort of flowery one, and so on. It's a group of these personalities, of these leaders of men, these chieftains, these lords. You find, among other commanders, Pierre de la Tournelle, Hugues and Gauthier de Fontaine, Jean and Cairn de Codon, all forming, and this is the beauty of European tradition, a cohesive force, right? That in the latter case is tasked with defending the bridge of Bouvines. Why? Because as we've seen, it's too few to escape for the whole army, but it's also like the only retreat route across the marshes. So it's, if anyone wants to avoid it, at least trying to sink into those terrain being simply caught in the mud and whatever, they can't pass through that. It's an escape route for some of the greatest notables of France. You understand, remember, the retreat was sealed off for all these great magnates. If the French lose, the entire French establishment is knocked out in a single blow. This is how important it is for the French to make the stand to begin with, to prove their spiritual, metaphysical, and racial superiority towards these other enemies. This is incredibly important, right? An incredibly important turning point in French history, not only. As we've seen, however, the French had prioritized their right wing. They had stationed there sort of the guys that they thought they had understood. As we've seen, we're talking there, powerful blocks here, not so sort of other men that were, as we've seen here a bit, fighting against the Count of Boulogne because they had some beef with those broader Flemish realities. It is true that the French right wing was actually fighting against the Count Ferdinand of Flanders, but there were, here we can't properly see all the feudal feuds and the hatred and so on. But it was understood that, in fact, those Flemish forces could be handled by the Champenois, by the Burgundians, in masterfully equestrian fashion, which is exactly what would occur, especially under this charismatic leadership of the Hospitalier Bishop Guérin, that reflected, by the way, his eagerness to engage swiftly. This is really noted in the contemporary accounts. Also, in fact, to save time for intervening in favor of Philip Augustus in the center and further in the formation, because they realized they had formidable foes in all the main, this essentially 3 or 4 if you count the Brabançon on the extreme right wing of the Anglo-German formation, like foes to cope with. Recognizing the battlefield's expanses, especially on his right, Guérin prevented enemy outflanking as well by extending his knights' formation to secure the flanking rear. Naturally, we don't know exactly how it happened, because you can't say, but why didn't Count Ferdinand do the same on his left, right? This is, of course, a tactic praised by scholarship, by saying, look at how much, because we have the sources actually telling us that he did. But as we said before, just as far as the flank attack, why didn't the enemy enact it? Like, were they dumb, or was there anything? Like, because we don't really have the most of the Battle of Bouvines is told by French sources, all right? And this is absolutely normal, and it's sort of weird how people believe that history is written by the winners in a general sense. Here, we don't really get the other side. There are, of course, plenty of other sources, but are relatively minor compared to what happened during the battle. But in terms of tactical detail, there are all political commentaries in other sources, but in tactical detail, it's what the French did is mostly what is known. It's completely normal for the early 13th century not to know in this relatively shaky Anglo-German coalition what the ultimate plan and decisions would have been. Besides, the money came from England. Otto was not in particularly good situation. As we've seen, a few German vassals had actually followed him, so There were the Flemish that in some ways were also different from both the Germans and the English, especially in a political sense. So, of course, the French were, in hindsight, better put in terms of, say, corporative and hierarchical leadership. They were really fighting as a cohesive unit, even though, again, there were Frenchmen, as we've seen from the other side, fighting against the Capetian order. Still, the latter held the moral sway on the battlefield, even though in general, like, this was a hardly fought one as well. But it was understood also by the enemies, seeing what kind of flower of France took the field at Bouvines. Really, it's something impacting from a moral point of view on the other side. Now, Guérin, that is a bit, again, the tactical master on the right, these divisions work fairly autonomously, right? There would have been some plans before the engagement, but much of what would have eventually occurred on the front, on the various sides, was a matter of how things simply happened during combat, what kind of situations you could exploit or whatever. Obviously, there's a broader logic, like the idea, I win on one side, like let's at least support the other without chasing the enemy in the moment. Like it's something, surely, yes, it would have had to be commanded, but there is also so much to do in the relative sectors you can't quite predict. So Guérin placed the most skilled and courageous knights, such as Gaucher de Châtillon, at the forefront, adhering to chivalric norms. These were some of the cockiest, most brutal and bloodthirsty people around. They wanted to be first because, again, this was mostly the times. These were the times of basically Richard Lionheart that had passed away recently. His brother was in charge on the other side. But, in battles like Hattin, etc., how critical, like the sense of, again, the states are really, like, especially in this feudal monarchies, taking over, but there is this incredibly courageously bloody noblemen that really want to prove in that the higher, from the higher social status, to prove that they are better even than the king, right? So they prove themselves, and in some ways there are still some social, cultural issues, like, I don't know, the newly knighted guys want to be out there. They're the youngest, they're the craziest in this sense, the ones who want to prove the most agile, so to get out there literally as an initiation, to as a self-sacrifice, to see if they survive, as a Russian roulette in the process. And just these guys want to smash into the enemy, like a cavalry charge here is something, again, knights with all those hundreds of kilos would smash into one another 45 kilometers per hour from both sides. It's as if you smash into something at 90 kilometers per hour. These people were fucking out of their mind, but they were also trained just only for that, and that this is what their entire collective and individual training was about. Because if you manage to smash into that thing and get out of there alive in many ways, without a broken spine and transpassed by a lance, you would really smash people. Like, imagine these horses running into human beings and probably breaking their necks and throwing them away meters away. Like, it's really brutal. And then into the melee, you have to start chopping people to pieces, smashing heads with maces, brains exploding, heads cut, the most kind of violent outcomes you can imagine, right? And this is what these people are trained in a lifelong fashion to be. Pure slaughtering machines, killing hundreds of human beings as the only purpose of existence. Some nobles, driven by pride rather than valor, sought front-rank positions, but Guérin knew that they were kind of weaker, and so he reassigned them to the rear. This is beautiful, because these guys are, by the way, obsessed by who's the coward here, and so in many ways status was more important than fear. But in order to carry out the aforementioned cavalry charges, you must be bit more than convinced. You must literally want to charge and blip you and everybody around you. If you're not into the full commitment of self-sacrifice into holy combat and coming out of biblical bath of blood, you're not good for the task. This is what the purest imperial Catholic tradition dictates by every physical and metaphysical standard. And so Guérin, that is also, again, an hospitalier, a bishop, he properly masters that military religious wisdom. He knows that only the bravest are to be ensured to lead the charge. This is what William de Breton tells us. So Guérin is really one of those, grizzled mother blippers that have seen it all before and absolutely reads through your soul and is able to line you up accordingly in the field based on your worth. And this is what actually will largely contribute to French victory. Historians like Ferdinand Lot and Hans Delbrück, so we're talking about like the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, mistakenly argued that for the same right initially thought that was just a single line. And this was not the case. As you understand, I explained this in the video about this. There were probably two ranks, not more, because you had actually the lighter guys that had to literally self-sacrifice themselves. The lighter, you've seen the ones brought by the abbot, that had to literally charge the guys that were heavier than them, but disordering them and softening their ranks up. And these were people who were willing literally to get themselves killed. You know that lots of you are gonna come out of there either dead or with broken bones or whatever. They're lighter, they're suffering. But again, the importance of fresh reserves. If you have this Flemish knights engaging against these guys, and then you get the heavier Burgundian and Champenois knights, the latter are going to devastatingly hit these guys, especially if there is a flank attack on top of that. And this tells you, by the way, how tough the Flemish knights themselves really were. The level here of actual expertise, also by the side of the Flemish nobility, is actually rough, because again, there aren't just those townsmen. There are noblemen in Flanders that still hold, and they are some of the finest also tournament organizers. I talked about this in the videos about medieval tournaments. There is also a playlist now about that. And so we're talking about some of the finest knights clashing on this side of the battlefield from both sides, right? Guérin's formation, described as a relatively shallow line, allowed for unified engagement while maintaining cohesion, a testament to his strategic acumen. Advised, by the way, by Gaucher de Saint-Paul, Guérin signaled the attack himself, initiating the very Battle of Bouvines that would cement Philip's control over Normandy and lay the foundations for French national unity. This is Bouvines in many ways. It's a hell of a battle. I can't imagine how epic this is, and this is why we really must talk way more about all of this, because it's such an epic battle that doesn't really find an equivalent, regardless of its. Again, every battle is magic in its own regard, and there are so many different engagements to show that. But Bouvines has this mystic magic aura to it that really recounts a story of honor, of brutality, of imperial, of royal, of majesty, of ambition, of different cultures, different nations, different peoples, from the most splendid ultra elite knights of the era to sort of dirty animal peasants cowed into the fray, which is not even quite the thing, because they would have been also, as we will see today. We stop here, but if you know how the battle went, those Saxon and those German and French infantrymen were rough, right? And you really need these dirty animals to carry that out, because that's, again, how combining these extremes you would have just by metaphysical standards the fulfillment of universal completion also on the battlefield. And so you have this dramatic instance where, again, literally Philip Augustus of France is hooked by this German infantryman that pull him like in the bowels of hell into that tonic dirt, and he manages to find out, and you can't imagine all the fierce clash with his bodyguards and other infantrymen chopping the enemy to pieces, and the other like keeping to fight and all this thing. It's really brutal and savage, and this is exactly what they were there for. Again, I made multiple videos about the Battle of Bouvines already. I'm very glad to actually have made this one. I really love this kind of content. We have to be much more concrete about it. We have really to cover much more stuff in this regard. And I can just give you 3 hints. Battle of Bouvines, July the 17th, 1214. That's the battle video I made. Again, I could have done better, especially with the pictures, because I re-uploaded the stuff, but I didn't have time. It's almost 3 hours, right, of tactical analysis of Bouvines. It's intense. It's really intense. The other is on the significance of the Sunday of Bouvines. Today we will add this other piece to the picture. There is also from Henry VI to Bouvines, the struggle for the empire. It tells a bit what was going on at that point. As a broader picture, but definitely we have to make several, if not tens actually, of videos about Bouvines, because it's just that incredible battle that you really are amazed by when you actually picture it, and are enthralled by its charm and its violence, its blood, its death, its victory. Right, it's glory. So that's absolutely beautiful, and speaks of heaven and hell in ways that hardly any other battle in the Middle Ages really were. You can really taste the soaked, the dirt of Bouvines, the grass of Bouvines, beautiful, sort of green, soaked in blood, and you can really taste that. You can really feel it. It's really there. And it's beautiful how the Holy Ghost manifests in some places where there is otherwise absolutely nothing. Like if you go to Bouvines today, it's more or less, again, just there is the church there, the village. But like other places, like, I don't know, I was in Cour, that we're talking about Flanders. In general, there are lots of course, of battlefields, namely in Flanders, for different historical reasons, what people would call geopolitical. That, of course, make you reflect on the fact that history passes through pretty odd paths in many ways, and I haven't created. There is a play this called Feudal Warfare, and I also created one about probably the chivalric war. There is something that simply unites this, as we were saying before, like England, France, Flanders, in a single, because I didn't really create it. I created a medieval chivalry playlist, but it's not really including, it's talking chivalry proper. It's not talking necessarily about any specific fight. It's mostly literature, it's mostly military theory, however you want to call it. All right. Nevertheless, for today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.